Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We are quite excited to come to you today after a long break from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're here with probably our two favorite guests. Well, Debbie Laaser as our guest, but our host, Greg Miller. We are back and producing fresh podcast content. And we're especially excited today, Greg and Debbie, because it's our first ever video podcast. And for those of you that are watching us on the Faithful and True YouTube channel, welcome. To those who are our usual loyal listeners that find us on iTunes and iHeartRadio and the Faithful and True website, we welcome all of you. This is an exciting new adventure for us, and we're happy to be with you today. Greg, it's good to see you again in person.
It is great to be back. And for those that don't know, Beth and I live in Chicago. So this is my first time back in Eden Prairie at the Faithful and True Center since February. So it's great to be back, and it does feel like being back home and just the comfortableness and the familiarity of this space, and so it is good to be here.
It is. You know, it's something we've all been on Zoom a lot in the last few months, and there's something just really different about seeing each other in person.
Right.
And it's so much richer, and so we're glad to have you here too, and to be offering some new material for our listeners.
Well, and we thank our listeners for their patience because, as Greg said, it's been since the beginning of March. And Aaron Wellman, our social media director, has done a wonderful job of posting encore presentations. But I'm sure our loyal listeners have been longing for fresh content, and we've been longing to give it to them as well. So today we're going to jumpstart that process and start producing new podcasts, starting with this one right here. And what are we going to talk about today, Greg?
Well, for this podcast and for a series that's coming up, we're going to be talking about change. And it just made sense as we were looking at just the reality of our circumstances and all that's been going on, that it would be important for us just to acknowledge the significant change that we were all experiencing. So much is different since the last time I was here in February. As a country, as a world, we navigate the complexity of the pandemic. And in some ways, we would say life is similar and familiar, but in other ways it has been significantly changed. And we love change. You know, that's the great irony of recovery is we want there to be change. It's our hope that we will be transformed by this journey. But we also want to acknowledge that change can be awkward and uncomfortable, and especially in the early days, just the chaos that it can create. So one of the things that we teach here at Faithful and True is the change model. This is something that Mark and Deborah introduced through the work of Virginia Satir. And we want to just use that as a beginning point for our conversation of how do we live in this new reality as we seek to navigate the pandemic.
We found it really helpful early on in our journey when we were working with our therapist, and she was trained by Virginia Satir. If you've been listeners of ours on the podcast, I know you've heard us talk about her because she was such an incredible family systems therapist back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so forth. And one of the things she created was a change model to help us understand why, when we do go through change, we feel so much anxiety, and to normalize it for us. Because I think for a lot of us, we go through life, but we're not really thinking about what's happening and why the emotions we're feeling are coming up for us. And so she helped us understand the stages as she defined them. There's certainly other change models out in the world, but we really liked hers. And why, when we go through those different stages of change and we know what they're about and we can expect them, it helps us to relax a little more. Just like I think our routines help us relax too. It's why I think we have so many routines, because we know what's coming and we can prepare for it, or we know what we have to move through next. When we don't know what's coming next, that's when our anxiety starts to rise. So obviously the pandemic has brought a lot of that kind of change. You know, it's true that when we are facing change, some of it we choose. You know, like moving to a new house or buying a new car or getting a new computer, and we have to learn a whole new system on that. And some of it that we don't choose at all. It comes at us. Like we're listening to wildfires, we're listening to the hurricanes last night that hit the South. We're obviously in the middle of a pandemic. So there are lots of changes that happen to us very quickly, including addiction, sexual addiction, which we talk about a lot. So it's in that change we kind of want to talk about this today.
Right. One of the things that you mentioned that I'm aware of is that when there is change, our typical reaction is about anxiety and maybe fear. And I often heard Mark say that safety is the absence of anxiety and fear. So it just lets us know that when there is change, whether we choose it or it's imposed on us, one of our responses is this belief that we're not safe. So understanding how change works and how to navigate it well, when we can create safety, then that helps us manage the anxiety and fear that the change may be triggered or may be triggering. What are some, for both of you, what are some of the changes that you are aware that you have experienced in the last 6 months?
Well, I think it's been interesting because the COVID-19 situation has forced all of us to make some procedural changes in how we go about everyday life. And I think some of these changes are going to remain with us after the vaccine is discovered and things have really settled way back down to normalcy. I think a lot of businesses and a lot of us are going to be doing things a little differently than we did in the past. I think even with, I think restaurants have come a long way as far as finding maybe more sanitary processes in how they serve food and that kind of thing. So, we've kind of learned along the way. My wife Cindy started to do more ordering of groceries that were delivered to the house. Well, that's kind of a convenience is what it is, but it's become such a popular way of getting food brought to your house that it's one of those, hey, why haven't we been doing this for a long time? So I think there's some day-to-day changes. Things here at Faithful and True have been more than interesting because when we made this change, we thought, how can we continue to offer the impactful workshops that we offer every month as Greg leads the way there. And so, as Debbie mentioned, using Zoom technology, and we have just been so blessed with how successful that has been, and which I think is going to lead to us contemplating offering, when it's safe for people to come in person, I'm sure we'll offer that. But we're also not going to be hesitant about offering virtual workshops because our clientele and our leadership has proven that they can be equally effective offering them in that format.
Yeah, for those who may not be aware, we've had the opportunity to offer both the men's workshop and the women's workshop virtually. And I can confess that when we first started talking about that, I kind of questioned the effectiveness of that. But after having done 6 men's workshop, we can see that it really can be an effective way to offer hope and to provide the resources of Faithful and True for people who aren't able to come in person.
I remember some of the very first changes probably happened around March 10th or 12th, somewhere in there, when all of a sudden we realized, I think Sherry's the one that brought it up, I think we need to think about all of us going home to work. And I was like, I don't know. I must have been minimizing the world at that point, but I'm like, well, you're probably right. We need to create safety here. And we all packed up our stuff and our sound machines and our computers, and we went home and established our little offices at home someplace. And it began to work beautifully. I think part of that, though, is we had the routine already in place of Zooming. That's something we were all doing at some point. And so thankfully, we didn't have to learn a lot of new things, which made the change, interestingly enough, a little bit easier for us. For those that weren't familiar with virtual anything, that was a lot of change for them.
Well, and I'm particularly proud and grateful to our clientele who have adapted to this new normal, and this new normal is Zoom video conferencing, and they have overcome their fears, and they have our counselors have kind of held their hand as they learned the technology, and we now have clients that are preferring, I didn't have to travel, I didn't have to drive over, and I was able to sit down in the privacy of my home office and have this counseling take place. But the same thing has happened with the Men of Valor workshop. I send out a questionnaire to the men that participate, and they give their impressions of their experience with you at the workshop. And one man in particular made a comment that really struck me, and he said, at first I was very apprehensive about whether the video conferencing or the video workshop would work for me. And he said, when I realized that part of my initial struggles with sexual purity came because of the internet, and then you showed me using the internet, so I'm able to find salvation.
Right.
So that was a powerful statement, that he went from doubt to confidence that the new technology was helping.
Absolutely. Well, and anytime we take something that has been destructive and are able to redeem it for something good and positive, that is a powerful experience.
That maybe is actually speaking to the stages, if we actually tell our audience what those stages
Right.
are, because we start in a place of our status quo, which means we all have a place of familiarity. Routine is a part of that, and it feels comfortable and safe, as you said.
Right.
But then this new information comes along that creates change, and our new information in terms of the pandemic was obviously about the virus, a lot unknown. There were still a lot of unknowns about how we were going to have to manage that. But that's where the anxiety starts to come in, when we get new information. We're going to have guests on here soon, some of our counselors who are going to join us with their story about talking about how the new information in regard to sexual addiction changed their life immediately. And so we'll put the same change model to use in terms of walking through their story.
And part of the challenge with new information is that question of, what information do I trust? I know that part of the chaos was, in the early days, we were getting a bunch of information about the pandemic, and sometimes it seemed contradictory to each other. So then you're just left with questioning, in this new information, what do I trust? What do I rely on? And that's part of the chaos itself. Many times when we're introduced to new information, sometimes it's clear and we can trust it, but other times we have to discern, how do I want to respond to this? What am I going to believe? And that's part of the chaos that is created, which brings us to the next place.
Yeah. And just before you go to that,
Yeah.
I would just mention that in the stage of new information, one of the things that's happening is our beliefs about everything are getting all stirred up. Like you were saying, we don't know what to believe. We don't know whether to believe our own thoughts. We don't know whether to believe the people we're talking to, what's happening to the world itself. So when our beliefs start getting stirred up, that's when our anxiety also starts stirring up.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do think that paying attention to the level of anxiety and fear that I'm experiencing in the change helps me to understand how unsafe I'm feeling or how unsafe I'm perceiving myself.
I wonder sometimes, maybe a question for our listeners, whether they're aware of when they feel unsafe. I think a lot of times we don't identify it as
Right.
that, but safety has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with, the basic needs of ourselves, our food, our shelter, having money to buy things that we need. It also has to do with health issues. Some of you have a lot of fear and anxiety around that. It's about an issue of being safe. And ultimately, I think the greatest fear that falls under this category of feeling safe is believing I might be all alone, that people will walk out of my life or I won't have anybody around me. I think for all of us, that's one of our greatest fears, actually.
Well, and what happens with this new information is we begin to understand how much of our safety is dependent upon our circumstances. And so ultimately, if I perceive that my circumstances are safe, then I can believe that I'm safe. And then if the circumstances change, then suddenly I feel very vulnerable. And understanding that ultimately the safety has to come from something other than my circumstances. And we can talk about that more, but just to recognize if my safety is dependent upon going to the grocery store and everything I need being there, and then I go to the grocery store and that stuff's not there, suddenly I feel vulnerable and exposed and unsafe. But the reality is I can still be safe even if I perceive that my circumstances aren't safe.
I think we'll have to talk about that in terms of the last stage of this recovery.
Yes.
Because you and I believe that, but I think that's one of the things we like to work on in our counseling sessions and workshops.
Absolutely.
So I interrupted you. The next stage
is chaos.
Yes.
And that is a word that we have used a lot over the last 6 months, is how chaotic everything seems. And When people ask, how has it been for Beth and I, we can acknowledge that, yes, it's been disruptive, but not significantly. Prior to this, for the last 11 years, Beth and I have been working from home. We've been doing Zoom appointments and Zoom groups. And so there was that familiarity. We don't have small children anymore. Our boys are grown. So we weren't navigating the complexity of teaching at home. So yes, it was disruptive. But for our listeners who every part of their life was put into chaos, suddenly both spouses were working from home and children were trying to do school, and if you had an aging parent that you were concerned about, trying to navigate that care. I have good friends who have had children born during the pandemic. And so not only are they dealing with the chaos of that change, but just this idea of safety in the hospital and bringing their infant home. So for some people, it has been incredibly chaotic because every aspect of their life has been disrupted.
And I think this was one of the points that Virginia wanted to make, that if we know that we are entering a period of chaos after we get new information and change has begun, perhaps we could settle in a little bit more without the extreme feelings of fear and loss. Now, that doesn't mean to say we should negate those or they wouldn't be there at all, but I just think knowing that it's a natural part of what we're going to experience does help us to have a little more calm in our life.
Right.
And that was her point. When we know that these stages are a natural process whenever we go through change because of new information, we can validate that we're not crazy, that there's not something wrong with us.
Right.
That, of course, I would be feeling this way because this has happened. And that's a great comfort to all of us. I know when we talk to people in recovery and they come in and they've had a lot of advances in how life is going and a lot of good changes, and yet they hit bumps in the road and they have arguments, of course, and they move apart from one another as they're trying to navigate, putting together a relationship. When Mark and I have been able to say to them in a couples session, it's just the first year, isn't it? And they say, well, yes. We go, well, typically Satir says that this first year of incredible change is going to feel very chaotic the whole year. And they're like, oh, well, I guess we're normal then.
Right.
And we're like, yes, you are.
Yes,
So they leave happily saying, well, we're on the path. So
Kind of reassuring, isn't it?
yes.
Well, it's kind of like getting on a flight and the pilot telling you, we're going to expect turbulence. Now, we don't like turbulence, and it's not good news. But when they tell you to expect it, when it actually starts to happen, there's a familiarity and a comfort because it was part of the journey. And so understanding that new information and change creates disruption creates chaos, and it is expected. And so if this has been incredibly stressful as you've tried to navigate all of the changes that you're experiencing, to normalize that and say, okay, this makes sense. And there's a comfort that comes in that validation that this was expected.
I think we're hearing that about the pandemic a lot, aren't we? That, this will not be where we are forever. We're being comforted by knowing this is very uncomfortable. There's a lot of chaos going on, and it won't be like this forever. So I think that is definitely the stage we've been in for a number of months here.
But Costco will get paper towels and toilet paper again someday.
It didn't take too long to get toilet paper, really, did it? I mean, we were worried there for a while here in Minneapolis, I know.
Well,
for sure,
what one of the things I was aware of is, so in the timing of the pandemic, there were other countries that began to experience the chaos before we did. And I heard an interview of someone, and they were saying, okay, given where your country is, what can we expect? And one of the things that the person said is, expect that there will be enough. And I know that soon after that, we entered into this panic. Is there going to be enough food? Are there going to be enough resources? Are there going to be enough supplies? And that message that I got from someone who's a little bit further down the road that said, expect that there will be enough. I found comfort in that maybe today when I go to the store, and this was early back in March, I would go to the store and there wasn't enough. I could remind myself, okay, this person who's ahead of me on this journey has said, remember that there will be enough. And sure enough, in time, the shelves were full and there were things that were available. And so even having that comfort, that invitation of maybe someone that's a little bit further ahead that can offer the reassurance of what to expect.
So this next stage we talk about in the growth model is integration of new things. So new integration, we're starting to practice putting in perhaps some new thoughts, some new belief systems, and we're starting to practice some new skills in this stage too. So I know you stopped by at our house last night, and you started to notice we have a table for our jigsaw puzzles, and we have a table for our artwork, and we have a room now where we do the yoga and the workouts, and it's like we created in our home all these little spaces because we knew we couldn't go out for quite a while, and we were starting to integrate the fact that life was going to look different. And it actually was kind of fun, which I think new integration creates some energy in us when we're doing that about anything. It's like, oh, I can change, and I can work with this, and I can learn some new things and grow. So new integration is a nice part of change, I think, when we're practicing some new stuff.
Well, and kind of the message is we can figure this out. I've talked to so many men, the men that I work with, and what I'm hearing from them is, yes, this has been challenging, this has been difficult, and we can figure this out. We've figured out where everybody can work and where kids can do homework, and we're figuring out a rhythm of our day. And Beth and I often sometimes remind ourselves we can do hard things. And especially when we were going through our recovery journey, one of the things that we would talk about to our boys is, as a family, we can do hard things. So if something hard comes up in your life, we have the skills, the capacity, the faith in order to navigate that. And so I think one of the things that happens in this integration piece is you start to discover personal resources that you have that you didn't even know that you had because you hadn't needed them before. But you begin to realize that we can figure some stuff out even in the midst of the chaos. And the figuring stuff out is what starts to bring normality to aspects of the chaos.
And that's about the belief system getting reestablished with some new beliefs. That's a belief for yourself that we can figure things out, or we're stronger than we thought. Or I think one of mine is, I'm a pretty resourceful person now, having worked through change in terms of a number of significant things. But those beliefs about ourselves and about others, maybe another belief about others that I'm experiencing is how kind everybody is becoming in our neighborhoods and helping each other out and getting to know each other better. There are a lot of kindnesses that are coming. So we're starting to integrate new belief systems too, which helps calm down that anxiety.
Right. And that brings us to the next stage that you mentioned, this idea of practicing, where over and over again we start doing this new experience and it starts to eventually feel familiar. So like I said, we live in Chicago and there are some parks, and regularly when you go to the park, it is common now to see groups of people sitting at a distance, talking and sharing food and enjoying each other's company, and recognizing now this is our practice, that we do gather in open spaces. We do have conversations. I know that you've talked about how y'all have created a fire pit in the back, and that's your place of community. And so it feels now comfortable and familiar to have people come over and sit in safe ways to connect and talk and experience community.
I think another thing, though, about practice is it can be awkward, and we can get frustrated by it because I think a lot of us have expectations that when we start to do something new, it should just be easy, and it should be there all the time. And, that's where when we start practicing, to have an expectation that at times it won't always be perfect, we won't do it so well. I remember when we first started experimenting with going to stores, wearing masks, what felt safe, what didn't feel safe, kind of practicing there, and we'd bump into times when that was too many people, we were too close, got to switch that up and change that up. So practicing too can be a little awkward, but eventually does lead us, if we're listening to ourselves about what's really working and how change is leading us to some new places in our life.
Yeah, Beth and I often joke about how long it's taken us to add masks as a part of our routine of leaving the house.
Yeah.
I'm used to checking for my wallet, my keys, my cell phone. I've over time added masks to that list.
Yeah, exactly.
And I do better. we have a dog, we take our dog for walks, and I'm familiar. If you're going on a walk with your dog, you take the dog, you take a leash, you take your keys, and now you take a mask. And there have been more than once where we've turned around. I had the dog in the leash, I just didn't have the mask.
Masks in the car,
right, yeah.
masks in the house,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so it does feel awkward, but then eventually it brings us to the next thing, and that's the new status quo, where we begin to recognize there's a familiarity to this and a comfortableness. And that's where that adjustment, that shift begins to really settle in. And again, if we're not careful, we begin to create safety again from this new normal, this new status quo. But the reality is, when something is familiar, we do start to find the routine comforting.
Mm-hmm. And I think also we're finding that if we're looking for it, generally new status quo will have something good in it and growth in it.
Right.
And, it kind of comes back to what you were talking about earlier about maybe for some of us who are really working on our faith journey, our sense of safety is being created by things other than our circumstances. And maybe our belief system is leading us to really learn and practice, integrate what it really means to depend on God in our life, rather than knowing we have to go out and take care of it and hopefully it's all going to work out the way we need it to work out. That's a new part of maybe integration in terms of this pandemic, is trusting that rather than trusting that we're going to have all the products we wish we could have.
Right.
I know that very point is what has helped me through this, is knowing that God has a plan, and my faith tells me He's never going to let us down. He's not going to let us, suffer more than we can handle. So it's kind of given some confidence in knowing that we can make it through this, like you were saying earlier, Greg. So we're as we wrap up this first video podcast, what are the closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, one of them I would share is actually from Satir again, and I don't know if it was anecdotal research actually or actual research, but when she created this change model, she said when we're not aware of the stages of change, we will probably tend to experience change, new information, at about 85% anxiety, very high anxiety. But what she noticed over the years, and I find this to be personally true, that when I'm aware of these stages and that they become a normal part of change, and I can say things like, well, of course, this is what I'm feeling now, or this is what's happening, that our anxiety drops way down to about 15%. And I have found that to be so true. And even in something as hard as this, and even in something as hard as Mark's death last year, I think knowing that there are certain things about this change that is natural and normal is something that really helps reduce anxiety and fear.
Absolutely. And one of the things I often talk to the men I work with about is this idea that ultimate safety comes from truth, not from circumstances. And so when I am overwhelmed, when I am in the chaos, to remind myself of whatever is true, what's true about me, what's true about the situation, and what's true about God. And the chaos can move me and challenge me to begin to trust. And we teach at the workshop, there's a difference between faith in God and trusting God. And using the imagery of the raising of Lazarus, this idea that when Jesus lingers, when Jesus doesn't come when we call him, when Jesus doesn't respond the way that we expect, at that point, the invitation is to trust. So even when Jesus lingers, can I trust that there is something good and redemptive and that there is a loving God that is for me? When I can remind myself of that truth, whatever is going on circumstantially, I can still be safe.
Wow. Thank you very much. You have been listening to Dr. Greg Miller, our Director of Men's Workshops and Workshops in general, and our Director, Debbie Laaser. A joy to be with both of you today, and thank you very much as we are entering this new chapter, and we're hoping that our listeners will visit the Faithful and True YouTube channel and watch us as we produce these podcasts. But until then, we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.